Between the Pages is brought to you by the Montreal Review of Books. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Between the Pages. I'm your host, Dimitri Nasrallah, and today we sit down with three authors whose imaginations roam the globe. It used to be not so long ago that when we read about other cultures and other worlds, it was through either international bestsellers or immigrant literature. The lines between who writes these stories and who reads them has blurred somewhat over recent years as writers and readers become more globalized in their thinking. Today we're sitting down with three authors whose imaginations transcend national boundaries to either find audiences elsewhere or to bring imaginations into our nation's narrative. Our first author is H. Nigel Thomas, the author of No Safeguards, published by Guernica Editions. This is your umpteenth book at this point. You have a long 10th novel, right?
No, not novel, my fourth novel.
Your fourth novel and multiple books of short stories, essays, and poetry too.
Right.
So a quite long and storied career. And this book was recently a finalist for the QWF Hugh MacLennan Paragraph Prize.
That's right.
So a good amount of recognition coming to No Safeguards. Our second guest is Mauricio Segura, the author of three novels, a fourth one on the way. The most recent available in translation is Eucalyptus, published by Biblioasis and translated by Donald Winkler.
That's right. Yeah.
And in French, your French readers read you via Boreal.
That's right, yeah. That's my publisher.
Our final guest is Denis Thériault, who is the author of three novels as well. Most recently in English, you can find him with the peculiar life of a lonely postman, for which I hear a sequel is in the works right now.
It's going to be published in March.
In March, and Denis' work has found its way into 15 languages.
Actually, yes. So it's actually happening right now.
So we're in the process of soon to be read around the globe. So definitely an imagination that has gone beyond Quebec and enamored the world. Nigel, I'd like to start with you because you come from St. Vincent, which you describe on your website as being 300 square miles, a place of very limited opportunity, and you've arrived at a place where you've put out so much writing in the world now. It's quite a distance to have traversed. Can you take us back to the beginnings and what life was like on St. Vincent?
Well, it's actually smaller than 300 square miles. It's really actually 300 square kilometers.
So it is quite a bit smaller then.
Yeah. What life is like in St. Vincent, you would like to know? Well, I mean, I grew up in rural St. Vincent, which meant that I was quite a distance from town, quite a distance from the best secondary schools. And in the elementary schools, you got the teachers who were generally untrained, and so on and so forth. It probably also meant that you had to be more imaginative in terms of the things that you did in order to fill your time. There was always the local cricket team, and there was a cinema house, though I wasn't allowed to go to it because my grandparents were puritanical. I grew up with my grandparents. But there were books.
Your grandfather was an avid reader, right?
Yes, he certainly was, and that fascinated me when I was, I guess, probably around 3, and I would go and hug him and look at the pages, etc., etc. And he said, "Would you like to read too?" And I'm sure I said yes. He kept a journal, so I'm not telling you this from memory. I'm telling you this from having read from reading his journal. And I told him yes, and he said, "Oh, okay, I'll teach you to read." And he did. And at 4.5, I was reading. and never stopped. And I suppose that's how I spent much of my time.
And you decided to make the move to Canada on your own at 21, right? Why the decision to come?
Well, we knew a great deal about Canada in the Caribbean. One of the subjects in school was geography. Geography and history were very important. After all, St. Vincent was a colony, and all colonizers are intent on conquering the souls of the colonized. So you certainly learned a great deal about British history of the British Empire, and you learned a great deal about the countries that Britain had colonized. And so a huge component of the geography curriculum and the history curriculum, I would also say, was about Australia, New Zealand, and certainly Canada. I remember one of the books we studied was Many Things from Many Lands, and that was a way of taking you on a kind of imaginary tour to various places. And another one was called Around the World. And I still remember a line from that book, and it went something like this. In Canada, they say that the house fires cook you, while at the back you freeze. I remember that line very, very, very well. And all of this was before we left elementary school. I'm not talking about matriculation, where one went into great detail. So yes, I knew a great deal about Canada.
I mean, the story, your life story is quite inspiring. You arrive here at 21, and it isn't until your 40s that you publish your first book. And
My first novel.
Your first novel. I mean, you really are building yourself up. You become a teacher, and you finish off at the University of de Laval in the end, right?
Yes.
At what point does the reading move to writing and publishing?
Good question. I remember I was at McGill and doing the diploma in secondary education. And this would have been 1975. And I found myself, I was walking on top of Mount Royal, and some thoughts went through my head. And I recognized them as poetry. By this time I'm 28. And I went home and wrote them down and found that thereafter for, I would say, about 5-6 years, I had the need to write poetry every day. Fiction came when I was in my mid-30s with short stories. And some of those short stories, in fact, one of those short stories morphed into my first novel, Spirits in the Dark.
Which was published in 93, right?
Yeah, yes, that's right. But the inception for it was in 83.
Okay, so it had a long gestation.
Yeah, and I remember Hugh Hood was at University of Montreal at the time where I was pursuing a doctorate. And he'd read it, and he actually did suggest that I offer it to your publisher, Véhicule, but I did not like the manuscript. I sat on it. And it wasn't until 90 that I went back to it. By this time I was at Laval, I had a decent computer and a little bit more free time, and I had thought quite a great deal about it. So I threw out the first 250 pages and took 50 and worked with that and so on. So that's really how, in more or less, how my writing career started. I like to say I didn't choose writing, it chose me.
It chose you. And that first book was published by Anansi. It was in Heinemann in the UK. They had a Caribbean writing series.
Right.
But you've gone on record as saying that since then, the act of publishing for a Caribbean writer, a black writer, a gay writer, is not that easy. The business of keeping the career going, sustaining it beyond the splash of the first book has been much harder than getting the work done itself.
Yeah, well, you know, publishers, as I often say, are business people, and The way they stay in business is by having people buy their books, and if the books don't sell, they're not going to publish them. And so Heinemann abolished its Caribbean writing series. It depended very largely on those books being used in the secondary school curriculum in the Caribbean. In fact, with my first novel, Heinemann initially turned it down because of the homosexual content. They felt that West Indians wouldn't want their children reading it. And it was only after Anansi went on board that they felt, okay, we can split publication cost, and therefore it's viable, and so on. Shortly after Spirits in the Dark was published, Heinemann closed the Caribbean Writers series because even then, they weren't making any money.
Do you find that your imagination has been caught between two worlds, the conservatism of the Caribbean culture and the conservatism of what North American readers are looking for? Are you somewhat, do you fall through a crack?
Well, I don't know that I see it so much as falling through a crack. I often say that my biggest challenge is to find metaphors that appeal to contemporary folk, younger folk. I am not a consumer of popular culture to any degree, and so if you ask me what's going on television, I won't be able to tell you. But that's probably how I was raised. My grandparents did me a terrible thing when I was growing up. They prevented me from going to the cinema. And so that part of it never excited me. I grew up without television. And I remember the first time I actually did sit down and watch television was 1968 in my aunt's house in New York. And the whole thing bored me. And it has bored me ever since. So yeah, so that's more the challenge. The conservatism comes in the sense that I was raised as a very conservative Christian. Today I am an atheist, but I am amazed at the extent to which that conservatism still holds on to my soul and sometimes even paralyzes aspects of it. It's incredible, So, the conservatism comes largely with audiences. One of the first shocks I got was when my first book was published. A lot of people had intended, they said, to give it, I'm talking here now about West Indian readers, to their friends. And once they discovered that the protagonist was gay, that was the end of it. They even told me that they regretted that they had bought it, etc., etc. So that's more the issue that one has to face.
So I mean, there's these
in terms of exactly audience
judgment.
For the 9 years I lived with Grandma, I felt she shouldn't be caring for me, that my place was with Anna, that she needed me. Most nights I fell asleep thinking about her, wondering if she was happy, wondering if we would ever be reunited, wondering if she was warm, especially when the BBC News gave the temperatures for Montreal or said that there was a blizzard. Night after night I dreamed we were together and would awaken right after, usually in the middle of the night, and spend a long time thinking about her. We heard from her every 2 to 3 weeks. She sent us a parcel at Christmas and on our birthdays. Then she remembered our birthdays. Grandma told us that Anna sent money to pay for our expenses, but I read all the letters Grandma got me once and reprimanded me, and in each of them, Anna apologized for not sending any money. Thank you.
Mauricio, you're broaching two different cultures. I mean, you have Chilean roots, and yet you publish into French-Canadian, Quebecois cultures. Do you recognize this dynamic of being in between two worlds with your writing and how it's received?
Sure, of course. I think migrant writers, because as Nigel, I'm a migrant writer, where we tend to to compare. We're always comparing two societies, sometimes even three, but in my case two. The Chilean society, which is the other society that I know enough that I can write about this other society, and the Canadian part. When I describe in my novels the Chilean society, I tend to focus on the rural side because it's much different than it's more traditional. So the comparison becomes obviously more interesting. So yes, of course, I would say that I'm a comparatist, but I'm always focusing on very specific parts of Canada, and I'm always interested in a neighborhood where I grew up. It's called Côte-des-Neiges. So I'm always describing this part of the world. And I'm always describing in Chile, I'm always describing the south of Chile where the family of my father came from, because it's more traditional, there's more history, and so I'm comparing these very small parts and I'm comparing them as microcosms of the whole societies.
You arrived here when you were 5, much younger than Nigel. What was the reason for your family's move?
Well, my parents were political refugees. They left Chile after the military coup in September 1973. We left afterwards. We went for a year in Argentina. That didn't work, and then we came here. So people talk a lot about refugees lately, but we were refugees back in 1974 when we came here to Canada.
And at what age did you start writing?
I started writing in my teenage years. I was in my primary education. I did it in a public school in Côte-des-Neiges, and I was a good student. So I went to Brébeuf, which is how would you call it, a bourgeois or high class French Canadian high school. And when I got there, I was sort of living I call it a schizophrenia, cultural schizophrenia. I went back to my family. Everything was in Spanish. It was the poor part of Côte-des-Neiges, and I was mingling. I was becoming friends with all these la bourgeoisie, French Canadian bourgeoisie. So there, I started questioning myself on stuff like identity. Am I a Quebecer? Am I a Latino? And that's how I started reading novels, much more than essays. Essays were too cerebral for me, for my temperament. And that's how I came by to reading novels and wanting to write novels.
So very early on in your adolescence, you're straddling identities within the same day. I mean, school is one life, and then your home life is quite another. When you began siphoning these ideas down into fiction, how easy was it to find a home for your perspective? Was the Quebecois culture ready to read what you had to write, or did it take a while to find a publication?
When I was mature enough to write something and to present something to a publisher, this was back in 1998 when I first published my first novel. The Quebec Society had been accustomed to migrant writers. There had been, I always talk about him because he has been important to me. Dany Laferrière was already there. So Sergio Coquis, which is another important writer to me, these guys were already there. People knew them. Dany had already written about the Haitian society and his immigration experience. So this facilitated everything for me when I came up. But I think my writing brings something new, brought at the end of the 90s, because I was describing the the second generation perspective. And Dany Laferrière is always writing about what he is. He's a first generation immigrant. On the horizon, pools of water vaporized as he advanced. His hand gripped the wheel, but it was as if it belonged to someone else. For several kilometers, Alberto had been driving oblivious to the fly that was spinning drunkenly, careening off the windows, buzzing furiously. Nor did he notice the bright yellow of the wheat fields rolling by on both sides. He only came to himself when the pickup crossed the old metal bridge over the Bio Bio, where there was a gaggle of children, giddy with laughter, bobbing along in the river's treacherous current.
Denis, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. We've seen two perspectives of coming from the outside and having to assimilate, but Mauricio brings up the interesting point of having predecessors out there. How, in your writing, seeing as how you're writing from the place where you naturally come from, who are your predecessors? Where do you create your foundation for what you end up building?
Well, it's interesting because I'm listening to Nigel and Mauricio, and I realize in a way that I'm an immigrant too, because I was born in a little town 1,000 kilometers east of Montreal on the north shore of St. Lawrence, which is called Sept-Îles, which is far away, you know.
It's a different world, yeah.
Yeah, it's a totally different world. I was born and grew up there, and when you grew up there and you live there, at 17 you have to leave because there's no university there. So I migrated at 17 in the big city, you know. It was Ottawa, Montreal, and it was some kind of a cultural shock for me too, in a way. But I have to talk about this little place because it's I realize now that it was a very peculiar place for the time. Sept-Îles, I was born there in the beginning of the 60s. 2 years before I was born, there was nothing there, a few fisher families. And 5 years after that, there were 50,000 people because it is a boom town, the real boom town, you know.
What was the industry that came in?
Iron ore industry. It's a port, you know. So in maybe 5 or 6 years, the population grew incredibly. And half of this 50,000 people were Quebecers, but the other half, the other 25,000 people were coming from everywhere in the world because the salaries were extremely high. So when I was young, I have a friend that was, he was not Chilean, but South American. I don't remember too much what country he was coming from. We have Arabs, we had a lot of European peoples. My first girlfriend was an Italian. So in a way, I think this very special place made me a globalized writer before the time, in a way, because it formed my imagination to other culture, you know. I realize that now.
It's really interesting in that we're seeing a parallel between what Mauricio was saying in terms of we choose our microcosms. And if we approach culture too broadly, we miss a lot. But if we break it down to, well, the microcosm is a Sept-Îles versus the microcosm of Montreal, well, then we really are migrating quite a bit. There's a different mindset that goes into comparing those two identities.
And you're coming to study in the big city, it's like it's exile, you know. You exile from your little world, or friends, or families, and you're coming 1,000 or 5,000 is the same thing in a way, you know. It's far. It's far. You can't go home easily.
Were you able to discover yourself through the contrast of identity that the move allowed?
Well, yes. Well, I lived half of my life there, and the other part in Montreal, Ottawa, in big cities. So, well, I feel very much. How can I say that? Between the two, you know, I can understand very well how people feel in a little town, little countries, and I can understand too how you feel when you're a citizen in a big town. There's a duality here, but a bit something that you like. Not the same cultural kind of duality, but there's another kind.
In a way, I mean, the cultural microcosms become details. It really is about the parallels we see, how we can begin to gain perspective on how we think. from having these two different models available to us?
Absolutely. I remember when I was young, I thought about the composition of the population of this little city, but it's a port too, and a big port. And when I was 14, 15, when you go in town on Friday night and Saturday night, we always have these gigantic boats that come from everywhere in the world to take the iron ore, you know. So you had these packs of sailors from everywhere in town going to have fun, you know. Italians, Japanese, and you heard these languages in your head. Maybe this was one of the first real cosmopolitan city in Quebec. This is not the image of the typical Quebecer village at this time. Absolutely not. It was very wide, very Catholic, you know, very Québécois pur laine, as you say.
And I mean, we skip ahead to your work. I mean, some elements of what you're describing find their way in there. I mean, the setting is Quebecois, but I mean, there's elements of Japanese haiku in here. There's a Guadalupan character. I mean, at what point do you see this identity you're describing move into your fiction as part of the portraiture?
I don't know. It comes from that. I'm certain of that. It comes from this strange place I come from. But you know, I feel very globalized in a way, but I didn't try to be like that. It came in a way naturally. I don't try to write world literature. Well, of course, you can't. I would lie if I was saying that I'd never think about it, but you must not try to do this thing. There's this old say, in which I believe very much, you know, they say you can't be more international than when you're very local. My first novel was taking place in this little place I was talking a few minutes ago. I changed the name of the place. I imagined the place, but it's very, very, very local. And this is the story of this other book is happening in a little, in a specific little neighborhood of Montreal city, but it could be anywhere in the world. In fact, the story could happen in any big city of the world.
Your first novel, Iguana, was a critical success in Quebec. There was a number of awards that it garnered. It was translated into English for Canadian readers, but commercial success didn't really arrive for you until your book started making it off this continent and finding their way to Europe, and that's where your career is significantly now.
I must say, yes, it's very difficult to make a living of writing in Quebec. The market is too small, there's not enough people. He dreamt of her every night, and the setting of these ethereal films in which Ségolène played the lead was the whole island of Guadeloupe, with its winding roads and sugarcane fields, its steep paths cutting through orchid-studded jungles dense with giant ferns, its mist-crowned mountains with strings of cascades and waterfalls dangling down the mossy green sides, and its towering La Soufrière, dormant but ever-threatening, its luminous villages with red sheet metal roofs and cemeteries filled with black and white checkered graves decorated with seashells, its carnival music, guoka players, she-devils dressed all in red, and other dancers in many hued costume wriggling their hips to the beat of bola drums while the rum flowed freely.
And perhaps I'll put this question out to everyone here. Do you sometimes find your readers are not where you expect them to be? I mean, your readers are halfway around the world. I mean, you couldn't have strategized that if you'd wanted to.
To be true, the truth is that I sell 2 times more books of these books in Taiwan than in Quebec, you know. And it's a small country. Taiwan is not such a big country. So it's true.
Yeah, the life of a book is quite unexpected. I've written 3 novels, and the first one is very popular. It's Black Alley is very popular in the schools. It's widely read in CEGEPs and high schools. The second one was much more acclaimed in France than in Quebec. It was called Bouche à Bouche. And the third one, well, the Latinos talked to me a lot about it. So the Latinos living in Ontario and in Vancouver. So it's really unexpected. I don't think anybody here figures this out before writing the book. I mean, it's just the way it is.
With the most books out there, I mean, you must have had this experience of unexpected readers finding parallels with your work.
Well, it's interesting because my first novel, Spirits in the Dark, it dealt with, it was one of the first books actually to deal with the topic of homosexuality in the Caribbean. And for some reason, it just got onto university curriculum. I don't, in terms of mass market sales, it wasn't a great success, but it ended up being taught in numerous universities, and became, critics were interested in it as well, both from the point of view of post-colonial and from the point of view of queer theory. My second novel, on the other hand, seemed to have been more reader-friendly, and that had more of a commercial success. My third novel, which takes on colonialism in a very profound way, seems to have had the least success and so on. Interestingly enough, my short story collection, Lives Whole and Otherwise, which has been translated as Devis Carcé, has taken off in a huge way in the French Caribbean, as something which I would have never expected. It's on a short list there for a prize. It's going to be in the high school curriculum, and so on and so forth. So you never know. You never know. Completely unpredictable.
Is there something to be said for sometimes being too well versed in a particular area, which can be abstract, like psychology or politics, that is something of that personal detail lost in the end? Is that what people actually connect to?
I don't know. When we talk about books that didn't find its public, I think of my second one, which is more formal, and it's more psychology oriented too. And I think you were talking about more traditional storytelling. I think people go a lot for that. There's a wide public when you go into that kind of writing. You get much more a wider public, but at the same time you're not as witty. You're not. It's not, for me. It's not as interesting artistically. So. Maybe you have to. I these days I try to blend both of these trends together.
Well, I just write what my imagination dictates.
Exactly.
That's how I work. I know it's not. I probably even shouldn't say this, but my publishers want something that's saleable. I write something that interests me, that obsesses me, might even be the better word.
And as you guys have already alluded to, sometimes you write a book that might be wrong for the present moment, but 20 years down the line, the world catches up with it. I'm afraid that's all the time we have to explore this fascinating subject of the globalized writer in a globalizing world. I would like to thank our three guests today. Our first guest is H. Nigel Thomas, the author of No Safeguards, published by Guernica Editions. You can find this at better bookstores everywhere. Our second guest is Mauricio Segura. You can find Eucalyptus in English translation, published via Biblio-Oasis. And finally, we're glad to have Denis Thériault, whose latest book in translation is The Peculiar Life of a Lonely Postman, with much more to come in English translation very shortly. As always, I would like to thank the Gaston-Miron building for hosting us today. And until next time, keep reading.